My mother slapped me at my father's funeral. The sharp, stinging crack of her palm against my left cheek echoed off the vaulted mahogany ceilings of Greater Shiloh Baptist Church, instantly silencing the muffled weeping and polite murmurs of 200 attendees. I did not flinch, I did not raise my hand to cradle my stinging face, and I certainly did not break eye contact with the woman who had just assaulted me over her husband's open casket. Evelyn, a 72-year-old woman who had spent her entire adult life perfecting the exhausting art of Southern bourgeois propriety, stood trembling in her custom-tailored black St. John knit suit, her hand still hovering in the chilled air of the sanctuary. "Hand it over, Rosalind," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a venomous urgency that had absolutely nothing to do with grief and everything to do with greed. Behind her, my 38-year-old brother, Terrence, shifted uncomfortably in the first pew, straightening his silk tie but keeping his mouth firmly shut, preserving his lifelong habit of letting me absorb our mother's wrath while he waited to collect the spoils. Over Evelyn's rigid shoulder, the polished bronze of my father's casket gleamed beneath the amber light of the stained glass windows, a silent, tragic witness to the ugly reality unfolding just inches from his resting place. "I am the widow," Evelyn whispered harshly, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp peppermint on her breath, masking her morning anxiety, mixed with the expensive Tom Ford perfume I had purchased for her just last week because she claimed her allowance was running thin. "You will give me the manila folder with the life insurance documents and the property deed transfers right now, before they close this lid and lower him into the ground." I stood perfectly still, my posture completely straight, feeling the heat on my face slowly harden into a cold, suffocating numbness. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many people around the world connect with the exhausting, thankless reality of being the designated anchor of a broken family. I gripped the heavy leather portfolio tighter against my side, the documents inside representing 35 years of my unpaid labor, late-night auditing, and the quiet, soul-crushing sacrifices that had kept this entire family out of federal bankruptcy court. For over 3 decades, I had been the family's unbreakable foundation, the quiet workhorse who absorbed their financial disasters, paid for their mistakes, and swallowed their passive-aggressive disrespect in the name of honoring my parents. I was the one who quietly covered the $4,000 monthly mortgage on Evelyn's sprawling Atlanta estate when my father's health began to fail and his pension wasn't enough to maintain her socialite illusions. I was the one who bailed Terrence out of 3 separate failed business ventures, paying off his aggressive creditors so he could continue posing as a successful entrepreneur on social media. Even my own daughter, Kiara, a 26-year-old woman sitting stubbornly in the second row, aggressively scrolling on her phone, was entirely detached from the public humiliation her mother was currently enduring, fully conditioned by this family to view me not as a human being who bleeds and breaks, but as an automated ATM that requires no gratitude. The absolute audacity of them demanding the financial portfolio I had meticulously built to protect my father's final wishes while his body was still above ground was breathtaking in its cruelty. Evelyn raised her hand again, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous mix of maternal entitlement and sheer panic, preparing to strike me a second time in front of the entire congregation to force my submission. Then the heavy wooden doors of the pulpit creaked open, and Reverend Sterling stepped up to the brass microphone, his deep, baritone voice cutting through the suffocating tension like a heavy steel blade. "Sister Evelyn," he boomed, the amplified sound causing my mother to freeze mid-swing, her hand trembling in the air. "I believe there is a profound misunderstanding this morning about who paid for this sanctuary, who holds the legal right to direct this service, and who is actually in control of this estate." The entire congregation inhaled sharply, a collective gasp that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the massive room. Evelyn's face instantly drained of color, her flawless foundation suddenly looking like a fragile mask as she slowly lowered her hand and turned to face the altar. Reverend Sterling adjusted his reading glasses, deliberately unfolding a thick watermarked legal document that looked identical to the one resting securely inside my leather portfolio. "Before we proceed with the reading of the obituary and the eulogy," the Reverend continued, his eyes locking directly onto my brother Terence, whose arrogant posture immediately collapsed into visible panic, "the deceased, Deacon Marcus Vance, left very specific legal instructions regarding the reading of a certain addendum to be executed immediately prior to the closing of his casket, in the presence of all assembled witnesses." Terence swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the back of the sanctuary, finally noticing the two quiet, broad-shouldered men in dark charcoal suits sitting near the exit, men I had hired from a premier private security firm to ensure the legal transition of power today remained strictly uninterrupted by my family's inevitable tantrums. I watched the subtle, terrifying shift in my mother's eyes, the sudden devastating realization that the narrative she had aggressively controlled for decades was rapidly slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers. They had all simply assumed that my father's death would act as an automatic transfer of wealth, handing the keys of the kingdom directly into their irresponsible hands, allowing them to finally cast me aside while endlessly enjoying the fruits of my lifelong labor. What Evelyn, Terence, and Kiara did not know, and what Reverend Sterling was about to reveal to our entire community, was that my father and I had spent the last 6 months of his life having long, agonizingly honest conversations in his sterile hospice room, legally and systematically dismantling the very financial foundation they thought they were standing on. As I looked at Evelyn's trembling shoulders, I didn't feel the urge to scream. I didn't shed a single tear. And I didn't weaponize my pain for the sympathy of the onlookers who were leaning out of their pews to watch the drama unfold. Instead, I felt an overwhelming, profoundly beautiful sense of liberation washing over my tired bones. The crushing weight of the strong black woman expectation, the cultural demand that I must set myself on fire simply to keep my family warm, was finally fracturing. The pastor's voice echoed against the stained glass, methodically outlining the exact financial boundaries I had begged my father to establish for years, officially cutting off the limitless supply of unearned grace they had violently demanded from me. Pursuant to the revised irrevocable trust established on October the 4th, Reverend Sterling read aloud, his voice steady and unrelenting, all life insurance policies, real estate holdings, and liquid assets previously accessible to Evelyn Vance have been immediately transferred into a blind trust, managed solely by the primary executor. Terence lunged forward from the pew, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at the pulpit, shouting, "That is fraudulent! My father was heavily medicated. He was not in his right mind when he signed that." Reverend Sterling did not even flinch, simply raising a calm hand to silence my brother while gesturing slightly toward the security contractors at the back, who stood up in unison. The shift in the sanctuary was palpable, a heavy, suffocating silence, replacing the murmurs as Evelyn slowly turned her head back to look at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying understanding. She looked at the red mark still burning on my cheek, then looked down at the leather portfolio secured under my arm, finally realizing that by striking the only person who had ever truly protected her, she had just sealed her own financial doom. "Reverend," Evelyn choked out, her voice stripped of all its usual aristocratic arrogance, "who is the primary executor of this new trust?" The pastor folded the document, looked down at the grieving widow with a mixture of pity and stern finality, and leaned into the microphone. "The sole executor, with absolute and uncontested authority over all assets, properties, and allowances," he announced clearly, "is your daughter, Rosalind." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush stone, as I smoothly opened my purse, pulled out my phone, and silently sent the pre-drafted text message to my wealth manager to permanently freeze their joint checking accounts, officially marking the precise, quiet moment my survival turned into reigning. The confirmation message from my wealth manager illuminated the screen of my phone with a quiet, sterile glow, a tiny digital checkmark that finalized the absolute freezing of all joint accounts, lines of credit, and discretionary funds previously accessible to my mother and brother, marking the exact second the financial oxygen in the room was officially cut off. The sanctuary of Greater Shiloh Baptist Church remained trapped in a suffocating, breathless silence, the kind of heavy, oppressive stillness that only follows a public execution, as 200 pairs of eyes darted between Reverend Sterling standing resolute at the pulpit, the red handprint slowly darkening on my left cheek, and Evelyn, whose flawless, arrogant composure had entirely disintegrated into a portrait of raw, unadulterated panic. My mother's hand, the same hand that had just struck me with the full force of her lifelong entitlement, fell limply to her side as she stared at the closed leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm, finally understanding that her violent attempt to force my submission had merely accelerated her own dethroning. Terrence, whose entire identity as a successful, self-made Atlanta entrepreneur was entirely funded by the quiet, desperate checks I had been writing him for the past decade, stood frozen in the front pew, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking like a hangman's noose, as the reality of his impending bankruptcy washed over his sweating face. I did not rub my stinging cheek, nor did I offer a single word of comfort to the woman who had birthed me, because doing so would have been falling back into the toxic, familiar choreography we had danced to for 35 years, the exhausting routine where they break things, and I bleed to fix them. Instead, I simply nodded to Mr. Carmichael, the funeral director, who immediately signaled his staff to step forward and secure the brass latches of my father's casket, the sharp, metallic clicks echoing through the vaulted mahogany ceilings like the closing of a massive vault door, sealing away the only man in this family who had ever truly seen me as a human being rather than a bottomless ATM. The transition from the church to the cemetery was a masterclass in Southern, hypocritical pageantry, with Evelyn suddenly leaning heavily on Terrence's arm, performing the role of the frail, devastated widow for the sympathetic whispers of the congregation, while intentionally ensuring there was no space for me in the primary family limousine. I did not fight for a seat in that vehicle of performative grief. I walked with quiet dignity to my own meticulously maintained, paid-off Mercedes sedan, welcoming the absolute silence of the plush leather interior as I drove myself behind the long motorcade, listening to the soft, mournful notes of John Coltrane pouring from the speakers, allowing the cool air conditioning to soothe the lingering heat on my face. At the burial site, beneath the sprawling, moss-draped oak trees of the historic cemetery, the midday Georgia sun beat down relentlessly, but the atmosphere among my immediate family was ice cold, their eyes avoiding mine completely as they stared into the open earth, already calculating how they were going to legally challenge the blind trust I now controlled. When the final prayers were spoken and the dirt was ceremonially tossed, the charade shifted seamlessly to the repast, held at Evelyn's massive 6-bedroom estate in the exclusive Cascade Heights neighborhood, a sprawling brick fortress of bourgeois illusion that I had quietly saved from foreclosure 3 separate times over the last 6 years, paying the exorbitant property taxes and the $4,000 monthly mortgage, while Evelyn hosted lavish garden parties and bragged to her sorority sisters about her blessed life. Entering the house through the heavy oak double doors, the air was thick with the smell of catered fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and the suffocating mixture of expensive perfumes and heavy colognes, a sensory overload that perfectly masked the toxic undercurrents swirling beneath the polite murmurs of the guests. I took a plate, placed exactly 3 items on it, and stood quietly near the bay windows of the formal dining room, sipping a glass of iced tea, observing the room with the detached, hyper-aware precision of a forensic auditor examining a fraudulent ledger. I watched as extended family members, aunts and cousins who only ever called me when their electricity was about to be shut off or their cars were being repossessed, subtly lowered their voices when I entered their line of sight, casting nervous, sidelong glances at me, clearly having already been fed Evelyn's panicked, distorted version of the morning's events. The specific loneliness of being the matriarch of a broken family is not loud or dramatic. It is the quiet, soul-crushing realization that you are standing in a house you paid for, surrounded by people who are eating food you financed, yet you are entirely isolated, viewed merely as an obstacle to their unearned inheritance, rather than a grieving daughter who just buried her father. My 26-year-old daughter, Kiara, finally approached me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floors I had paid to refinish last summer, her face twisted into a mask of petulant annoyance rather than sympathy or support. "Mom, why did you have to embarrass Grandma like that in front of the whole church?" Kiara hissed under her breath, her eyes darting nervously toward the living room where Evelyn was holding court among the deaconesses, actively playing the victim. "You know she has high blood pressure and now everyone is whispering about us, plus Uncle Terrence said you froze the accounts. Which means the closing costs for my new luxury condo in Midtown are going to bounce on Monday. And I need you to fix this right now before I lose my deposit." I looked at my only child, a young woman I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my peace to raise, providing her with the best private schools, the safest neighborhoods, and a life entirely insulated from the struggles I had endured, and I felt a profound, chilling hollow open up inside my chest. She hadn't asked how my face felt after being struck by her grandmother. She hadn't asked how I was coping with the permanent loss of my father. And she hadn't paused to consider the immense legal and emotional burden I was currently carrying. Her only concern was the uninterrupted flow of capital to fund a lifestyle she had never worked a single day to earn. "Your Uncle Terrence is completely correct, Kiara," I replied, my voice completely devoid of the maternal panic she was used to manipulating, keeping my tone as smooth and cold as polished marble. "The accounts are frozen, the trust is sealed, and your grandfather's money is no longer available to subsidize anyone's luxury real estate ventures. So I suggest you call your realtor immediately and withdraw your offer, because I will not be authorizing a single wire transfer." Kiara's jaw dropped in genuine shock, her eyes widening as if I had just slapped her, completely unable to compute this sudden, catastrophic disruption to the automated support system she had taken for granted her entire life. But before she could throw the inevitable tantrum, Terrence's heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder, his grip uncomfortably tight as he physically steered me away from the crowd and down the long, shadowed hallway toward our late father's private study. He shoved the heavy mahogany door closed behind us, the latch clicking shut, instantly cutting off the noise of the repast, leaving us in the heavy, wood-paneled silence of a room that still smelled faintly of my father's Old Spice cologne and stale cigar smoke. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" "Rosalind?" Terrence demanded, dropping the sophisticated businessman persona entirely, his voice vibrating with a raw, desperate aggression as he backed me toward our father's massive leather-topped executive desk. "You marched into that church with your hired goons and humiliated this family, all to steal the estate that rightfully belongs to Mom, and by extension to me. So you are going to sit at this desk, log into that iPad, and reverse whatever fraudulent paperwork you forced a dying, medicated old man to sign, or I swear to God, I will drag you through civil court for the next 10 years until you are bankrupt." I did not shrink away from him. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let a single ounce of fear show on my face, because I knew exactly who Terrence was. A 38-year-old hollow shell of a man, a serial failure who hid behind custom suits and leased sports cars, projecting an image of wealth while secretly drowning in debt. You don't have the capital to retain a lawyer for 10 days, let alone 10 years, Terrence, I stated calmly, setting my iced tea down on a stone coaster, carefully smoothing the front of my black silk blazer. The trust is bulletproof, drafted by a top-tier forensic legal team in Boston, not a local strip mall attorney you can intimidate. And every single cent of Dad's estate is now legally locked behind my sole discretion, which means the $75,000 business loan you defaulted on last month will not be bailed out by Mom anymore, because her allowance is now strictly capped at covering basic utilities and groceries. Terrence's face contorted in rage, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, trying to use his physical size to dominate a woman who had spent 30 years surviving corporate boardrooms full of men far more dangerous than him. "You bitter, lonely, jealous bitch," he spat. The ugly truth of his resentment finally boiling over, stripping away decades of fake brotherly love to reveal the vicious parasite underneath. "You've always hated that Mom loved me more. You've always hated that I was the golden child while you were just the reliable workhorse. And now you're using a dead man's money to buy the respect you couldn't earn on your own." The insult hung in the quiet air of the study, heavy and intended to break me, but it simply bounced off the impenetrable armor I had spent the last 6 months forging in the fires of my father's hospice room. The truth was, I wasn't jealous of Terrence. I pitied him, because without my invisible labor propping him up, he was absolutely nothing. "Pack up your apartment, Terrence," I whispered softly, leaning in slightly, my voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute authority. "The lease is in Evelyn's name, which means it's now managed by the trust, and I formally terminated the renewal contract at 9 o'clock this morning. You have exactly 30 days to vacate before I have the sheriff remove your belongings." Terrence turned ghostly pale, the aggressive posture instantly collapsing as the terrifying reality of his new, unshielded existence hit him with the force of a freight train, and without another word, he turned and stumbled out of the study, slamming the heavy door behind him, fleeing back into the crowd of oblivious guests to try and figure out how to survive a life he had never actually participated in. Left alone in the quiet sanctuary of my father's office, I took a deep, cleansing breath, allowing the silence to wash over me, feeling the incredible, almost intoxicating lightness of finally setting down a burden I had carried since childhood. I walked slowly around to the back of the heavy executive desk, running my fingers over the worn leather of my father's chair, remembering the late nights we had spent in this very room over the past few months, poring over decades of financial records, discovering the horrific extent of Evelyn and Terrence's financial abuse. My father had not just changed his will to protect me, he had changed it to punish them, having finally realized in his dying days that his enabling had created monsters who viewed him only as a host to feed upon. I reached into the deep pocket of my blazer, pulling out a small, heavy brass key that my father had pressed into my palm during his final, lucid moments, his voice weak but his eyes burning with an intense, tragic urgency. Following his instructions, I knelt on the Persian rug, reaching underneath the heavy wooden frame of the desk, feeling for the hidden, false panel we had installed together years ago when I first started organizing his taxes. The panel clicked and slid away, revealing a heavy steel lockbox bolted directly to the floorboards, cold to the touch and untouched by the greedy hands of my mother or brother, who had undoubtedly scoured this room for cash the moment my father was admitted to the hospital. I slid the brass key into the lock, turning it with a heavy, satisfying click, and pulled the lid open, revealing not money, not jewelry, but a single thick leather-bound ledger and a cheap prepaid burner phone with a sticky note attached to the back bearing my father's unmistakable, shaky handwriting. The note read, "They didn't just wait for me to die, Rosie. They tried to speed it up." My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I picked up the burner phone, pressing the power button and waiting agonizingly for the cheap screen to flicker to life, connecting to the local cellular tower. When the home screen finally loaded, it opened directly to a saved text message thread, not between my father and a stranger, but a deeply buried, secretly forwarded chain of messages between Evelyn, Terrence, and a third number that I immediately, sickeningly recognized as belonging to my own daughter, Kiara. I scrolled up with a trembling thumb, my breath catching in my throat as I read the chilling, methodical exchanges, dated exactly 3 weeks before my father's unexpected rapid decline. The doctor said his heart can't take the stress of the new medication adjustments, Evelyn had texted. If we mix the 2 prescriptions like Terrence suggested, it just looks like cardiac failure. We need the primary life insurance payout before Rosalind takes over the medical proxy on the 15th. My blood ran ice cold. The betrayal so profound it felt like a physical knife twisting in my stomach. But it was the response from my own flesh and blood, my daughter Kiara, that entirely shattered the final fragile illusion of family I had left. Just make sure you get him to sign the equity release forms before it happens, Grandma, Kiara had replied, the timestamp glaring at me like a neon sign of pure evil. I need that $100,000 for the condo deposit cleared by the 1st, and Mom will never approve it if she finds out early. I sat there in the silence of the study, the heavy scent of Old Spice wrapping around me, staring at the screen that proved my own mother, brother, and daughter had actively conspired to accelerate the death of the only man who truly loved me, all to secure a down payment on a luxury condo and a lifestyle they couldn't afford. The grief, the exhaustion, and the lifelong desire for their approval evaporated entirely in that exact second, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly clear resolve. They didn't just view me as a safety net. They viewed us as disposable commodities. And now they were going to learn exactly what happens when the foundation they took for granted decides to systematically, ruthlessly, and legally crush them to dust. The burner phone felt heavier than a block of solid lead in my palm, its cheap, cracked screen illuminating the dimly lit confines of my father's mahogany-paneled study with a toxic, glaring light that burned the horrific reality of my family's treachery directly into my retinas. But instead of screaming, instead of hurling the device against the antique bookshelves or collapsing onto the Persian rug in a puddle of hysterical tears, I simply sat back in my father's oversized leather executive chair and took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the very last frayed threads of my maternal instinct and daughterly devotion snap with a quiet, irreversible finality. For 35 years, I had operated under the exhausting, culturally ingrained delusion that if I just loved them hard enough, if I just provided enough financial stability, if I just absorbed enough of their toxic disrespect without complaint, they would eventually see my humanity and grant me the basic dignity of being loved in return. But staring at the text messages between my mother, my brother, and my own 26-year-old daughter, casually discussing the precise pharmacological combination required to induce my father's fatal cardiac arrest just to accelerate a life insurance payout, I realized that my boundless grace had not made them love me. It had simply made them dangerously comfortable with using me as a shield for their monstrous greed. I carefully pressed the power button, plunging the study back into the comforting, heavy shadows, and slipped the phone into the inner zippered compartment of my leather portfolio, right beside the thick, brass-cornered ledger my father had hidden in the floorboard safe, moving with the terrifyingly calm, hyper-focused precision of a woman who has entirely detached her emotions from her physical body. I didn't feel like a grieving daughter anymore, nor did I feel like a betrayed mother. I felt like an independent forensic auditor who had just been handed the exact tools needed to dismantle a corrupt, sprawling criminal enterprise that just happened to share my bloodline. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my black silk blazer, taking one last lingering look around the room that smelled of old books and Old Spice cologne, silently thanking my father for loving me enough to arm me with the truth before he took his last breath. And then I turned the brass knob and stepped back out into the suffocating, performative circus of the repast, The hallway was lined with framed family portraits, smiling faces projecting a flawless bourgeois illusion that now made my stomach physically turn. And as I walked toward the formal living room, the sheer volume of fake sympathy and calculated networking hit me like a wave of suffocating heat. Evelyn was sitting on the velvet settee, holding a lace handkerchief to her dry eyes, nodding tragically as the pastor's wife patted her hand, while across the room, Terence was aggressively downing his third glass of expensive bourbon, his face flushed and sweating as he nervously checked his phone, undoubtedly panicking over the newly frozen bank accounts. But it was the sight of Kiara that truly anchored the ice in my veins. My only child, the girl whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose private school tuition had cost me years of sleep and promotions, was standing near the catered buffet table laughing softly with her cousins, her perfectly manicured fingers holding a crystal glass of sparkling cider, completely unbothered by the fact that she had actively conspired to murder her grandfather just to secure a down payment on a luxury midtown condo. I watched her for a long, quiet moment, studying the slope of her jaw and the familiar arch of her eyebrows, features she had inherited from me, and I realized with a chilling clarity that she viewed my endless sacrifices not as acts of love, but as weakness, treating my bank account like an automated utility that she could simply command to dispense funds whenever her insatiable appetite for status required it. I did not walk over to confront them, I did not flip the buffet table, and I did not demand the room's attention to expose their murderous plot, because engaging with them on any emotional level would have given them the opportunity to gaslight me, to spin my righteous anger into the stereotypical narrative of the crazy, bitter black woman ruining a solemn family gathering. Instead, I simply walked out the heavy oak double doors of the house I had saved from foreclosure 3 times, the heavy latch clicking decisively behind me, a sound that felt less like an exit and more like the ceiling of a tomb, and I walked down the expansive brick driveway to my car, leaving them to feast on the illusions they had killed to protect. The drive back to my own home, a sleek, modern, paid-off townhouse in the quiet, tree-lined enclave of Vinings, was a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. I rolled the windows up, sealing myself in the luxurious silence of the leather interior, and drove through the twilight streets of Atlanta, the city lights blurring into long golden streaks against the darkening sky, while the profound, crushing loneliness of my existence finally settled over me like a heavy wool blanket. The specific isolation of the matriarch is a unique, invisible prison. It is the exhausting reality of knowing that if you stop holding the rope, everyone will immediately complain about the rope dropping, but absolutely no one will ever pause to ask if your hands are blistered and bleeding. For over 2 decades, I had been the family's crisis manager, their financial planner, their emotional dumping ground, and their primary punching bag. And as I pulled into my private garage and killed the engine, sitting in the absolute stillness, I realized that I had spent my entire life violently defending a family that was actively trying to destroy me. I carried my leather portfolio inside, the soft click of my heels against the imported hardwood floors echoing in the empty, pristine space, and I walked directly into my home office, turning on the brushed steel desk lamp that cast a sharp, focused pool of light over my massive glass desk. I opened the portfolio, placing the burner phone on the glass surface, and then carefully opened my father's heavy, leather-bound ledger, the thick pages crackling softly in the quiet room as I began to read the meticulous, handwritten records he had secretly maintained during his final months. What I found within those pages was not just evidence of petty theft, but a sprawling, complex web of federal financial crimes that Evelyn and Terence had systematically executed under my father's failing name, confident that I would simply cover the inevitable deficits as I always had. According to the ledger 2 years ago, Terence had convinced Evelyn to secretly use the property deed of the Cascade Heights estate, the very house I'd been paying the mortgage on, as collateral to secure a massive high-interest commercial loan for a phantom logistics company that didn't actually exist outside of a mailbox in the Cayman Islands, filtering the money back into their personal checking accounts disguised as consulting fees to evade federal taxes. But the true, devastating brilliance of my father's ledger was the revelation of exactly whose Social Security numbers they had used to register these fraudulent shell companies, afraid that using their own names would trigger an IRS audit due to their history of bankruptcies. Evelyn and Terrence had bypassed my father entirely and legally registered the fraudulent entities under the names of the only two people in the family with flawless credit scores, myself and Kiara. I stared at the faded blue ink of my father's handwriting, detailing how Kiara had willingly signed the incorporation documents for a fake charity supposedly dedicated to youth financial literacy, using it to funnel illegal campaign contributions and launder the stolen equity from the house, all in exchange for a promised $100,000 payout that she planned to use for her luxury condo. They had trapped me in a horrific legal snare. If the federal government ever investigated the missing funds or the tax evasion, the paper trail would lead directly to my door, potentially stripping me of my auditing license, my assets, and my freedom, while they walked away entirely clean, living off the life insurance money they had murdered my father to obtain. It was a flawless, cold-blooded setup, designed by a brother who resented my success, enabled by a mother who felt entitled to my servitude, and facilitated by a daughter who viewed my destruction as an acceptable price for her own comfort. I picked up my phone, my hand completely steady, the tears that had threatened to fall entirely evaporated by the searing heat of my quiet, righteous fury, and I dialed the private cell phone number of Trey Stevenson, a ruthless, deeply principled assistant United States attorney specializing in federal financial crimes, who also happened to be a man I had dated briefly in college before I chose the safe, exhausting path of managing my family's chaos over pursuing my own happiness. The line rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered, the sound of paperwork shuffling in the background indicating he was still at his desk in the federal building, downtown despite the late hour. "Rosalind," Trey said, his tone softening with a mixture of professional respect and lingering personal affection. "I heard about your father's passing. I am so incredibly sorry for your loss. I know he was the only one in that house who truly understood your worth." "Thank you, Trey," I replied, my voice stripped of all emotion, vibrating with a cold, terrifying clarity that immediately caused the shuffling of paper on his end of the line to stop. "I need you to come to my house immediately, off the record, because I have in my possession a ledger and a burner phone that contains undeniable, documented proof of a multi-million-dollar federal tax fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud conspiracy orchestrated by Evelyn and Terrence Vance." There was a heavy, loaded silence on the line as Trey processed the sheer magnitude of what I was saying, his sharp prosecutor's mind instantly recognizing that I was offering up my own blood relatives on a silver platter. "Rosalind," Trey finally said, his voice dropping to a serious, cautious whisper, "if you hand that evidence over to me, I have to act on it. I can't protect them. I can't sweep it under the rug, and the mandatory minimums for the dollar amounts you're implying will guarantee that your mother and brother will die in federal prison." I looked down at the burner phone, my mind flashing back to the text message where my daughter casually discussed mixing the medications to stop her grandfather's heart, and I felt a profound, chilling peace settle over my soul, the kind of absolute serenity that only comes when you finally decide to stop saving people who are actively trying to drown you. "I am not calling you to protect them, Trey," I said softly, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office at the dark, sprawling canopy of the city. "I am calling you to prosecute them to the absolute fullest extent of the law. And I need you to bring a forensic imaging device to copy this phone, Because before the IRS raids their accounts for the tax fraud, the Homicide Division is going to need these text messages regarding the intentional tampering with my father's cardiac medication. The sharp intake of breath on Trey's end was the only response I needed, a confirmation that the trap was now officially set. And as I ended the call and set the phone down on the glass desk, a single glowing notification popped up on the screen of the burner phone, a new, unread text message from Terrence that read, "Rosalind froze the accounts early. The Spellman tuition check for Kiara just bounced. Call the offshore broker now. We need to move the house equity before she realizes Kiara's name is on the deed." The glowing screen of the cheap prepaid burner phone illuminated the polished glass surface of my desk with a harsh, synthetic light. The incoming text message from Terrence glaring back at me like a venomous snake uncoiling in the dark, explicitly detailing his frantic, desperate plan to contact an offshore broker and drain the remaining equity from the Cascade Heights estate before I could discover that my own daughter's name was illegally forged on the property deed. I stared at the faded blue text bubble, completely paralyzed not by fear or grief, but by the sheer breathtaking audacity of a 38-year-old man who had never successfully balanced a standard household checkbook in his entire life, now genuinely believing he possessed the intellectual capacity to outmaneuver a licensed 30-year veteran forensic auditor who held the master keys to his entire financial existence. For decades, I had been the silent, invisible architecture of this family, the load-bearing wall that absorbed the relentless, exhausting shockwaves of Evelyn's compulsive spending and Terrence's catastrophic entrepreneurial failures, swallowing my own stress and sacrificing my own youth so they could parade around Atlanta's elite social circles, wrapped in the illusion of generational wealth. And their ultimate reward for my lifelong servitude was a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy to literally stop my father's heart and frame me for federal tax evasion. The soft, rhythmic chime of the security gate at the front of my Vinings townhouse suddenly pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of my office, signaling the arrival of Assistant United States Attorney Trey Stevenson, a man whose sharp legal mind and uncompromising moral compass represented the exact opposite of the toxic, parasitic environment I had just permanently exiled myself from. I pressed a button under my desk to remotely unlock the front door, not bothering to stand or fix my makeup, simply waiting in the dim light of my office as the heavy, familiar sound of Trey's dress shoes echoed down the imported hardwood hallway, each footstep sounding like the steady, inevitable ticking of a federal countdown clock that was about to obliterate my family's fraudulent empire. Trey stepped into the doorway, his tall, broad-shouldered frame filling the space, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked slightly rumpled from a long day at the federal courthouse, his dark eyes instantly scanning the room with the practiced, hyper-vigilant intensity of a seasoned prosecutor before locking onto my face, immediately registering the unnatural, terrifying calm radiating from my posture. We had dated briefly in our mid-20s, back when we were both hungry, ambitious graduates trying to conquer the world, but I had ultimately pushed him away, choosing the exhausting, thankless path of managing my mother's chaotic household and raising my daughter Kiara as a single mother, sacrificing my own chance at romantic peace because the strong black woman conditioning had convinced me that my only true value lay in my ability to suffer from my bloodline. "Rosalind," Trey said softly, his deep, gravelly voice washing over me with a mixture of professional caution and lingering, unspoken affection, carefully closing the heavy oak door behind him to seal us inside the soundproofed sanctuary of my office. "Tell me exactly what I am looking at, because if you hand me evidence of a federal crime involving your immediate family, I cannot protect them, I cannot unsee it, and the Department of Justice will not stop until the indictments are unsealed." I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not offer a fragile, trembling apology for dragging him into my nightmare. Instead, I smoothly rotated the burner phone and my father's heavy, leather-bound ledger across the glass desk, pushing them directly into the pool of light cast by the brushed steel desk lamp, presenting the tools of their destruction with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon handing over a scalpel. "I'm not asking for your protection, Trey, nor am I asking for your mercy," I replied, my voice stripped of all maternal warmth, vibrating with a lethal, absolute sovereignty that caused him to pause and study me with a newfound, silent reverence. "What you are looking at is documented, irrefutable proof of a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy, aggravated identity theft, and the intentional tampering with prescribed cardiac medication resulting in the accelerated death of a federal witness, orchestrated by Evelyn Vance, Terrence Vance, and Kiara Vance." Trey's jaw tightened, his professional demeanor hardening into something incredibly dangerous as he reached into his breast pocket, retrieving a pair of black nitrile gloves before he even touched the ledger, treating the documents not as the desperate mistakes of the woman he once loved's family, but as a live, radioactive crime scene. He sat in the leather guest chair opposite my desk, opening the thick ledger to the exact page where my father had meticulously recorded the routing numbers for the offshore shell companies Terrence had established in the Cayman Islands, his eyes scanning the faded blue ink as the horrific magnitude of the financial crimes began to materialize before him, his silence speaking volumes as he traced the illegal flow of capital from the forged commercial loans directly into Evelyn's personal checking accounts. When he finally picked up the burner phone and read the deeply buried text messages, specifically the exchange where my 26-year-old daughter casually instructed her grandmother to mix my father's heart medications so she could secure the $100,000 deposit for her luxury midtown condo, Trey's breathing hitched, a flash of pure, unadulterated disgust crossing his stoic face as he looked up at me, clearly struggling to reconcile the monstrous, sociopathic entitlement of the girl he remembered buying ice cream for when she was 7 years old. "Rosalind, this isn't just tax fraud. The combination of the forged property deeds, the use of your Social Security number to register the fake logistics charity, and the premeditated medical tampering elevates this to a RICO violation," Trey explained, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper as he pulled a small, heavy forensic imaging device from his leather briefcase and connected it to the burner phone via a specialized cable. The mandatory minimums for these charges, especially considering they conspired to defraud the federal government while simultaneously plotting a homicide for financial gain, will guarantee that your mother and brother will never breathe free air again. And Kiara is looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Hearing the exact mathematical calculation of my only child's impending prison sentence should have shattered me. It should have triggered the deep, instinctual maternal panic that usually forces mothers to throw themselves on the grenade to save their children. But as I sat there in the quiet luxury of the townhouse I had paid for with my own blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had poured into Kiara's private violin lessons, the flawless designer wardrobe she demanded, the endless sacrifices I made to ensure she never felt the sting of poverty, only for her to view me as a disposable, automated utility that was entirely secondary to her desire for a luxury high-rise apartment. Kiara is a 26-year-old adult who signed federal incorporation documents and actively participated in the murder of the only grandfather she ever had, I stated evenly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the federal prosecutor sitting across from me, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on the glass desk. She made a calculated transactional decision to trade my father's life for real estate, and now she will have to pay the invoice for that transaction. Copy the phone, Trey, take the ledger, and initiate the warrants. Just as the progress bar on Trey's forensic cloning device hit 50%, The absolute silence of the office was violently shattered by the shrill, demanding ringtone of my personal iPhone resting next to my keyboard, the screen illuminating with Kiara's contact photo, a perfectly curated, smiling selfie taken at a luxury brunch spot I had paid for last month. Trey glanced at the ringing phone, then back at me, his eyes asking a silent question. But I simply reached out and tapped the speakerphone icon, allowing the crystal-clear audio to fill the room, determined to let the federal prosecutor hear exactly how the monsters I had raised operated when they thought they were still in control. "Mom, what the hell is going on with the bank accounts?" Kiara demanded the second the line connected, her voice devoid of any grief for her grandfather or respect for her mother, dripping instead with a petulant, aggressive entitlement that made my stomach physically turn. I just tried to wire the earnest money to my realtor for the Midtown condo, and the transaction was declined. And when I called the private wealth manager, he told me my signature authorization had been permanently revoked by the primary executor. "You need to call him right now and fix this glitch, because if I lose this unit to another buyer, I am never speaking to you again." The sheer, blinding arrogance of her threat, weaponizing her affection, betting that my deep maternal fear of losing my daughter would force me to instantly comply and release the stolen funds, was a tactic she had successfully used against me since she was a teenager. But she was entirely unaware that the woman on the other end of the phone was no longer her exhausted, endlessly forgiving mother, but the executor of an estate who had just handed her text messages over to the Department of Justice. "There is no glitch, Kiara," I replied, my voice echoing in the quiet office, so dangerously calm, so entirely devoid of emotion that the silence on the other end of the line became instantly palpable, as if she could physically feel the atmospheric pressure drop. "The bank is operating exactly as I instructed them to. Your grandfather's trust is permanently sealed. The discretionary funds have been legally frozen, and the Spellman tuition check that Evelyn promised you has already bounced." "You can't do this to me," Kiara suddenly shrieked, the polished, sophisticated veneer instantly cracking, revealing the desperate, greedy child underneath as the reality of her impending financial ruin began to set in. "That money is mine. Grandma promised me that $100,000 from the life insurance. She said the paperwork was already done, and if you don't release those funds right now, Uncle Terrence is going to call his offshore broker and liquidate the house equity anyway, and you won't get a single dime." I looked across the desk at Trey, who was furiously taking notes on a legal pad, having just captured a recorded voluntary confession of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering directly from the suspect's mouth, his pen scratching loudly in the otherwise silent room. "You are an adult who orchestrated a massive real estate fraud, Kiara, and adults pay their own tuition and buy their own condos," I said smoothly, refusing to raise my voice or engage in the chaotic screaming match she desperately wanted. "I strongly suggest you start looking into federal student loans, because by this time tomorrow, the luxury lifestyle you feel so entitled to will no longer exist." I ended the call without waiting for her response, plunging the office back into a heavy, absolute silence. The finality of the disconnected line hanging in the air like the smoke after a gunshot, severing the last emotional cord tying me to the toxic wreckage of my bloodline. Trey quietly finished the data transfer, unplugged his device, and carefully placed the burner phone and the original ledger into heavy plastic evidence bags, sealing them with bright red tamper, evident tape that signaled the official, irreversible beginning of the end for Evelyn, Terrence, and Kiara. The FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division will move simultaneously at exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, Trey informed me, his voice strictly professional now, the weight of the impending federal raid settling over the room as he stood up and adjusted his suit jacket, though his eyes lingered on me with a profound, unspoken respect for the unimaginable emotional strength it took to execute my own family. They will freeze every remaining asset, seize the Cascade Heights property, and execute the arrest warrants. You need to be prepared for the absolute chaos that is going to erupt when the federal agents kick down your mother's custom oak doors." I nodded slowly, thanking him as I walked him back down the long hallway, the quiet click of the security gate locking behind him, serving as the final seal on the trap. But even as I walked back into my empty, silent office, my mind was already 3 steps ahead of the federal government, specifically focused on the panicked text message Terrence had sent about the offshore broker. Terrence genuinely believed he had a few hours to quietly move the stolen house equity out of the Cayman Shell Company before the domestic bank freezes, fully locked him out, completely unaware that as the primary executor of my father's estate, I possessed absolute, uncontested legal authority over every single entity that touched Evelyn's name, including the fraudulent ones. I sat back down at my glass desk, opened my high-powered encrypted laptop, and pulled up the final page of my father's ledger, locating the master administrative login credentials for the Onyx Holdings offshore account that my father had managed to copy before his death. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the lethal, silent precision of a sniper, navigating through the complex international banking portals until the sterile blue dashboard of the Cayman account materialized on my screen, immediately displaying a bright yellow pending notification at the top of the interface. Terrence had indeed just submitted an emergency wire transfer request for $850,000, the entirety of the stolen equity from the Cascade Heights estate, attempting to blindly route it to an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet to fund his escape before the walls closed in. I did not panic, I did not call him to gloat, and I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Utilizing my verified absolute authority as the estate's executor, I simply clicked the Cancel Transaction button, followed immediately by the Initiate Total Asset Freeze and Report Suspicious Activity protocol, watching with a cold, devastating sense of satisfaction as the screen blinked, permanently locking Terrence out of his own escape pod, leaving him completely trapped in a financial void, entirely unaware that the multi-million-dollar safety net he thought he was standing on had just vanished into thin air, exactly 10 hours before the FBI battering rams were scheduled to destroy his front door. The glowing cancel transaction notification on my encrypted laptop screen felt less like a digital command and more like the final, heavy, irrevocable swing of a federal gavel, sealing the absolute destruction of my brother's frantic escape plan and officially trapping him within the rapidly collapsing walls of his own fraudulent architecture. I sat in the profound, immaculate silence of my home office, the brushed steel desk lamp casting long, sharp shadows across the imported hardwood floor, watching the offshore banking portal automatically log me out and lock the account under a massive, impenetrable federal freeze, essentially reducing Terrence's stolen $850,000 to a string of inaccessible frozen code. There was no adrenaline rush, no manic, triumphant laughter, and absolutely no lingering guilt. There was only the cold, sterile, and breathtakingly beautiful serenity of a woman who had finally decided to stop donating her blood to feed a family of parasites. I closed the laptop, the soft click of the metallic chassis echoing in the quiet room, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the sprawling, glittering canopy of the Atlanta skyline, realizing that for the first time in 35 years, my mind was entirely free from the suffocating, crushing anxiety of anticipating Evelyn's next financial disaster or Terrence's next catastrophic failure. For decades, I had allowed them to convince me that my sole purpose on this earth was to be their unbreakable foundation, their designated crisis manager, the quiet workhorse who was expected to absorb their disrespect, fix their mistakes, and smile politely through their abuse simply because we shared a bloodline. But my father's dying gift, the ledger and the burner phone, had fundamentally shattered that toxic, culturally ingrained delusion, revealing that my endless grace had not earned their love. It had only subsidized their monstrous greed. I did not go to sleep that night, Instead, I walked into my pristine, minimalist kitchen, brewed a pot of loose-leaf chamomile tea, and spent the remaining hours of the darkness meticulously organizing my own personal financial portfolios, legally severing the very last microscopic ties that connected my name to anything belonging to Evelyn or Terrence, ensuring that when the federal government dropped the hammer at dawn, not a single spark from their blazing inferno would land on my tailored suits. By 4:30 in the morning, the deep velvet blackness of the sky began to bleed into a bruised, pale purple, signaling the arrival of a day that would permanently alter the trajectory of our entire lineage, and I moved to my master bathroom to prepare myself for the climax of this 30-year tragedy. I showered in the scalding heat, washing away the lingering scent of the funeral parlor and the suffocating perfume of the repast, and dressed myself with the deliberate, methodical precision of a warrior donning armor for a final siege. I chose a flawlessly tailored, pristine ivory silk suit, a stark, brilliant contrast to the heavy, performative black mourning clothes I had worn the day before, pairing it with a simple, heavy gold monogram necklace that my father had given me when I passed my CPA exam, my hair pulled back into a sleek, impenetrable chignon that left no room for vulnerability or softness. At 5:15, I stepped into my garage, the air crisp and cool, and slid into the driver's seat of my Mercedes, the engine purring to life in the absolute quiet of the morning, and I drove out of Vinings, navigating the empty, fog-draped streets of Atlanta toward the exclusive, historically affluent neighborhood of Cascade Heights, my hands perfectly steady on the leather steering wheel. I did not drive there to gloat, nor did I drive there to save them. I drove there because after a lifetime of being invisible, after decades of watching Evelyn and Terrence perform their grand illusions of generational wealth on a stage that I had quietly funded, I deserved front-row seats to watch the curtain permanently fall. I parked my car 2 blocks down from Evelyn's sprawling 6-bedroom brick fortress, tucking the vehicle beneath the sweeping branches of an ancient moss-draped weeping willow, cutting the engine and rolling the windows down just enough to let the cool morning air inside while I waited in the pre-dawn shadows. The neighborhood was painfully quiet, the manicured lawns and towering oak trees completely still, the massive, opulent homes standing like silent monuments to Southern bourgeois pride, completely unaware that the tranquility of their exclusive enclave was about to be violently shattered by the consequences of my family's breathtaking arrogance. At precisely 5:58, the heavy, unnatural silence of the street was broken by the low, synchronized rumble of heavy diesel engines, and I watched through the windshield as a convoy of 6 unmarked, matte black tactical vans and 3 federal SUVs rolled smoothly into the neighborhood, turning off their headlights as they approached Evelyn's property line like a pack of wolves surrounding a wounded deer. The precision of the federal raid was a terrifying, beautiful choreography to witness. Before the vehicles even came to a complete stop, the doors slid open, and 24 heavily armed agents, wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bold yellow acronyms of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, poured out into the immaculate, dew-covered lawn, moving with a silent, lethal efficiency that instantly stripped away any lingering illusion of safety Evelyn's wealth might have provided. 4 agents immediately sprinted to the perimeter, securing the wrought iron side gates and the backyard, while the lead tactical team marched straight up the sweeping brick walkway toward the custom-oak double doors that Evelyn had so proudly bragged about at her sorority luncheons. I stepped out of my car, the soft click of my heels against the pavement masked by the heavy, authoritative thud of tactical boots, and walked slowly down the sidewalk, stopping just at the edge of the property line, folding my arms across the pristine ivory silk of my suit, watching with an absolute chilling detachment as the lead agent raised a massive steel battering ram and slammed it directly into the center of the custom oak doors. The sound of the wood splintering and the heavy deadbolts giving way echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a bomb going off, instantly triggering the security alarms of the surrounding mansions. The shrill, piercing sirens tearing through the morning air as the agents flooded into the grand foyer, their heavy boots trampling over the imported Persian rugs I had paid to have professionally cleaned just last month. Within less than 2 minutes, the majestic, carefully curated illusion of Evelyn's aristocratic life was entirely dragged out into the harsh, unforgiving light of the early morning sun, beginning with my brother Terence, who was shoved out of the shattered front doorway by 2 massive federal agents, his hands violently zip-tied behind his back, wearing nothing but expensive silk pajamas, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Get your hands off me! You have the wrong house!" Terence screamed, his voice cracking hysterically, entirely stripped of the arrogant, sophisticated businessman persona he used to belittle me just 24 hours prior, his bare feet stumbling over the sharp brick steps as the agents forced him down onto his knees on the damp grass. "I am a prominent business owner. You cannot do this. I have offshore accounts. I can sue this entire department." The lead agent, a tall, imposing man who looked like he had zero patience for entitled fraudsters, didn't even blink, simply pulling a laminated federal warrant from his tactical vest and shoving it directly into Terrence's sweating face. "Terrence Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, and RICO violations," the agent barked, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn, loud enough for the neighbors who were now beginning to peek through their plantation blinds to hear every single humiliating word. "You don't have offshore accounts anymore, Mr. Vance. The Cayman Central Authority froze Onyx Holdings at exactly midnight. Your net worth is currently negative $8 million, and you are facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years in federal prison. So I strongly suggest you shut your mouth before I add resisting arrest to the indictment." Terrence's jaw dropped, his eyes rolling back in his head as the absolute crushing reality of his total financial annihilation hit him with the force of a freight train, finally realizing that the glitch Kiara had complained about last night was not a banking error, but the calculated, lethal strike of a sister who had finally stopped playing the victim. But the true masterpiece of the morning was the emergence of Evelyn, who was forcefully escorted out of the house by a female agent, her flawless hair wrapped in a silk bonnet, wearing her expensive floor-length St. John robe, her face contorted in a blinding aristocratic rage that she genuinely believed could somehow intimidate the federal government. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Evelyn shrieked, struggling violently against the agent's grip, her voice dripping with the toxic Southern bourgeois entitlement that she had used to terrorize me my entire life. "I am a senior deaconess at Greater Shiloh Baptist Church. My late husband was a pillar of this community. You are trespassing on my private property, and I demand to speak to your superior immediately. I will have your badges stripped for this disrespect." The female agent stopped at the bottom of the brick steps, forcefully spinning Evelyn around and locking a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists, the sharp metallic click entirely drowning out Evelyn's delusional demands. "This property belongs to the federal government as of 6 o'clock this morning, ma'am, seized under the Asset Forfeiture Act due to the fact that you purchased it using funds laundered through a fake charity, registered under a stolen Social Security number," the agent stated coldly, securing the cuffs tightly while Evelyn gasped in genuine shock, entirely unable to comprehend that her social status was completely useless against a federal indictment. "You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain regarding the tampering of Marcus Vance's prescribed cardiac medication. You have the right to remain silent. And considering the evidence we already have from your burner phone, I highly recommend you use it." Evelyn's entire body went rigid, her eyes widening to the size of saucers as the words "conspiracy to commit murder" and "burner phone" echoed across her pristine front lawn. The heavy, suffocating realization that her most profound, monstrous secret had been exposed finally cracking her impenetrable armor. It was at that exact moment, as she frantically scanned the perimeter for any familiar face, any shred of salvation, that her eyes landed on me, standing quietly at the edge of the property line in my glowing ivory suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable, looking less like her daughter and more like the grim reaper of her financial empire. "Rosalind!" Evelyn screamed, her voice cracking with a desperate, frantic panic, her maternal entitlement instantly overriding her terror as she tried to lunge toward me, only to be yanked back by the federal agent. "Rosalind, tell them to stop. Call the wealth manager. Call your fancy lawyers and fix this right now. They are trying to take the house. They are trying to take my money. You are the executor. You have to protect your family." I did not move toward her. I did not offer a comforting smile, and I did not let a single ounce of the pain she had inflicted upon me for 35 years show on my face. I simply stood there, embodying the absolute terrifying grace of a matriarch who had finally recognized her own supreme worth, watching the woman who had slapped me at my father's funeral now begging for my mercy in handcuffs on her own front lawn. Suddenly, the front door of the mansion burst open again, and my 26-year-old daughter, Kiara, was dragged out by 2 agents, kicking and screaming hysterically, still wearing her silk pajamas, her perfect blowout ruined, her face stained with streaks of mascara as the reality of her ruined life finally set in. Mom, please!" Kiara wailed, seeing me standing on the sidewalk, her voice entirely devoid of the cruel, petulant arrogance she had weaponized on the phone last night, replaced by the desperate, terrified shrieking of a spoiled child who had finally touched a hot stove. "They're arresting me! They said I'm going to prison for the charity documents. Mom, you have to pay them off. You have to fix this. I can't go to jail. My reputation will be ruined. I'll lose the condo." The sheer, breathtaking narcissism of her screaming about her reputation and her luxury condo, while simultaneously being arrested for conspiring to murder her grandfather, was the final, definitive validation of my choice, entirely extinguishing any lingering, microscopic spark of maternal guilt I might have harbored deep in my soul. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, just close enough for my voice to carry over the chaos, maintaining a tone so quiet, so perfectly smooth, and so profoundly detached that it sliced through their hysterical screaming like a surgical blade. "I am not here to fix your mistakes, Evelyn, nor am I here to pay your bail, Kiara," I said, my voice echoing with the devastating, undeniable authority of a woman who held the absolute power of life and death over their futures, my eyes locking onto my mother's terrified face. "You wanted the inheritance so desperately that you stopped my father's heart to get it, and you thought you could use my name to shield yourselves from the consequences, because you believed I was nothing more than a blind, obedient workhorse who would always sacrifice myself to protect your illusions." Evelyn trembled violently, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, not tears of remorse for the husband she murdered or the daughter she abused, but tears of pure, selfish terror as she realized the unbreakable foundation she had stomped on her entire life had just purposefully crumbled, dropping her directly into the abyss. "You're my daughter," Evelyn choked out, her voice a pathetic, rasping whisper, attempting to use the sacred bond of motherhood as a final, desperate weapon against the federal machine. "You can't do this to your own blood, Rosalind. We are your family." I tilted my head slightly, the morning sun catching the heavy gold monogram necklace resting against my collarbone, offering her a smile that was completely devoid of warmth, a smile that signaled the absolute permanent end of my servitude. "You are not my family, Evelyn," I replied softly, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum, crushing impact. "You are simply a bad investment that I have officially written off. enjoy federal prison, and please be aware that as the executor of the estate, I have already sold your custom furniture to cover the legal fees associated with your prosecution." I turned my back on them without waiting for a response, ignoring the deafening, hysterical screams of my mother. My brother and my daughter, as the agents, forcefully shoved them into the back of the armored tactical vans, the heavy steel doors slamming shut, permanently sealing away the toxic parasites that had consumed my youth. And as I walked back to my Mercedes in the cool morning air, leaving the ruined, splintered doors of the Cascade Heights fortress behind me, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace, knowing that the trap was fully sprung, the empire of lies was reduced to ash, and the rest of my life, every single breath and every single dollar, would finally, entirely, belong only to me. The drive away from the shattered, splintered oak doors of the Cascade Heights estate felt less like a morning commute and more like a profound metaphysical ascension. The heavy, suffocating gravity of my family's relentless demands finally releasing its 35-year grip on my soul as my Mercedes glided silently through the fog-draped streets of Atlanta. For my entire adult life, my nervous system had been permanently wired to a state of exhausting hypervigilance, constantly bracing for the inevitable disastrous phone calls informing me of Terrence's latest defaulted loan, Evelyn's newly overdrawn credit cards, or Kiara's exorbitant entitled demands. But as the morning sun finally broke through the canopy of the ancient weeping willows, bathing the leather interior of my car in a warm golden light, the silence inside the cabin was absolute, pristine, and breathtakingly beautiful. I did not turn on the radio, nor did I shed a single obligatory tear for the 3 blood relatives who were currently sitting in the back of armored federal tactical vans. Instead, I simply allowed the profound, healing quiet to wash over my exhausted bones, realizing with a crystalline clarity that the immense, crushing weight I had carried for decades was never actually mine to bear. It was a heavy, parasitic saddle they had violently strapped to my back, and I had finally, permanently unbuckled it. As I merged onto the interstate, heading toward the towering glass spires of the downtown financial district, my encrypted smartphone, resting securely in the center console, suddenly illuminated with an incoming call from Aunt Coretta, Evelyn's older sister, a woman who had not spoken to me directly in over 4 years, reserving her communication strictly for moments when she needed me to quietly cover the catering costs for the family's lavish summer reunions. I did not decline the call. I pressed the speakerphone icon with a perfectly steady, manicured finger, allowing the chaotic, panicked shrieking of my extended family to fill the sterile air of my vehicle, fully prepared to salt the earth of the toxic village that had enabled my mother's monstrous behavior. "Rosalind, what in the name of God is happening over there in Cascade Heights?" Coretta wailed, her voice thick with a mixture of performative religious shock and deeply ingrained selfish panic. Cousin Valerie just called me screaming that the FBI kicked in Evelyn's front door and dragged her out in handcuffs, and when I tried to log into the family business portal to check my monthly distribution from the logistics charity, the entire system is locked with a federal seizure notice. "You need to drive down to the federal building right now and tell those agents they made a mistake, because my mortgage draft is scheduled for tomorrow, and your mother promised me that allowance was guaranteed." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her demand, expecting me to march into a federal facility and commit perjury to protect a stolen monthly stipend she had done absolutely nothing to earn, was a perfect, sickening microcosm of the cultural disease that had infected my entire bloodline. They had all known, on some fundamental unspoken level, that Terrence's phantom businesses were entirely fraudulent, and they had all happily turned a blind eye to my father's rapid, unnatural physical decline, so long as the stolen money continued to quietly flow into their checking accounts, subsidizing their illusions of bourgeois grandeur, while I was forced to bleed in the dark to keep the foundational architecture intact. "There is no mistake, Coretta," I replied, my voice perfectly level, stripping away decades of the required deferential Southern politeness to reveal the cold, hard titanium underneath. The logistics charity was a front for money laundering and federal tax evasion, built on stolen property equity and my forged signature. And the monthly distribution you have been happily collecting for the past 2 years was funded directly by the premeditated murder of my father. The line went dead silent, the kind of heavy, breathless void that only occurs when a deeply buried, unspoken truth is suddenly dragged out into the blinding light of day, instantly obliterating the comfortable, hypocritical lies they had all used to justify their greed. "You listen to me very carefully, Coretta," I continued, my tone dropping to a register of absolute terrifying sovereignty, refusing to allow her a single second to formulate a gaslighting defense. "Evelyn, Terrence, and Kiara are currently being booked on RICO charges and conspiracy to commit homicide, and as the primary executor of my father's estate, I have already handed over the complete unredacted financial ledgers to the United States Attorney's Office, which means the IRS is currently tracing every single dollar of that stolen money, including the fraudulent distributions sent to your bank account. I strongly suggest you hang up this phone, call a highly competent criminal defense attorney, and prepare to explain to the federal government exactly why you were receiving a $4,000 monthly stipend from a logistics company that did not own a single truck." I tapped the screen to disconnect the call before she could even draw a breath to respond, immediately accessing my phone's settings to permanently block her number, alongside the numbers of every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who had ever treated me as an automated teller machine, disguised as a relative. I navigated my Mercedes off the exit ramp and pulled into the secure underground parking garage of the high-rise tower that housed my independent forensic auditing firm, Onyx Financial Forensics, a company I had built from the ground up through years of grueling, relentless work, entirely separated from the chaotic, fraudulent empire my family had constructed. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the pristine fabric of my ivory silk suit, my heavy gold monogram necklace resting coldly against my collarbone like a polished badge of honor, and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse suite, stepping into a massive, minimalist office space encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the city I had quietly helped to build. My wealth manager, Arthur Sterling, a brilliant, ruthless 60-year-old financial strategist who had spent the last decade watching me absorb my family's financial abuse with silent, simmering outrage, was already sitting at my massive marble conference table, a thick stack of watermarked federal documents fanned out perfectly before him. "Good morning, Rosalind," Arthur said, standing up to respectfully pull out my leather chair, his sharp eyes scanning my face, clearly searching for any signs of the expected maternal grief or traumatic breakdown, only to find the absolute impenetrable calm of a woman who had just successfully amputated a gangrenous limb. I watched the federal asset seizure notifications hit the wire at exactly 6:05 this morning. The Cayman authorities completely locked Terrence out of the offshore accounts precisely as you instructed, preventing him from liquidating the $850,000 in stolen equity, and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division has successfully secured the Cascade Heights property. I sat down gracefully, crossing my legs and folding my hands over the cool, polished marble, feeling a deep, satisfying hum of pure power vibrating through the room. "Thank you, Arthur," I replied softly, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted federal seizure reports, tracing the exact methodical destruction of my family's stolen wealth. "Have the secondary trust accounts been completely severed from Evelyn's Social Security number?" Arthur nodded, sliding a crisp single-page document across the table, bearing the heavy, embossed seal of the federal court. "The severing is absolute. Your father's legitimate assets, his authentic life insurance policies, and his untouched investment portfolios have been entirely walled off and legally quarantined in the blind trust under your sole executive control, completely untouchable by the federal forfeiture orders targeting your mother and brother. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, tinged with a profound, almost reverent professional awe. But that is not the most significant development of the morning, Rosalind, because you voluntarily surrendered the burner phone and the ledgers, acting under your strict fiduciary duty as a licensed independent forensic auditor to report federal crimes. You officially bypassed the familial association and triggered the IRS whistleblower program. I looked up, meeting his gaze, fully aware of the immense, world-shifting implications of that specific federal statute, because your meticulously documented evidence directly resulted in the recovery of over $40 million in stolen federal taxes, unpaid penalties, and laundered commercial equity across their various shell companies. Arthur explained, pulling out a polished silver pen and tapping it against the final page of the dossier. The Department of the Treasury is legally mandated to award you, the independent whistleblower, a non-discretionary bounty of 30% of the total recovered assets. You did not just protect yourself from prison, Rosalind. You are going to receive a completely clean, tax-free, and heavily guarded federal payout of exactly $12 million, directly transferred into your private accounts by the United States government. The number hung in the quiet, air-conditioned atmosphere of the penthouse office, a massive, undeniable testament to the exact value of my unseen labor, transforming the decades of financial abuse I had endured into the very foundation of an impenetrable, multi-generational empire that belonged exclusively to me. I did not smile, I did not cheer, and I did not engage in any performative displays of triumph. I simply picked up the silver pen, signed my name on the final line of the federal compliance forms with a steady, elegant script, and slid the documents back across the marble table. Wire $2 million into the high-yield corporate expansion fund for this firm, I instructed calmly, my mind already operating at a velocity entirely divorced from the petty, chaotic survival mode my family had forced me to live in. Allocate another $1 million into a heavily guarded, blind educational trust for underprivileged minority girls in Atlanta who are currently being forced to abandon their education to care for toxic family members. I want them to have the financial oxygen I was denied. As for the rest, lock it down in the absolute highest-tier municipal bonds. Arthur smiled, a genuine, rare expression of profound respect, gathering the documents and placing them securely into his leather briefcase, recognizing that he was no longer advising an exhausted, besieged daughter, but a sovereign architect who had just secured her throne. Later that afternoon, exactly as Trey Stevenson had warned, the mandatory federal arraignment hearing was scheduled at the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, and I chose to attend not as a weeping, supportive family member desperate to post bail, but as the legally appointed executor of the estate, required by law to formally observe the reading of the charges. I entered the sprawling, wood-paneled federal courtroom through the heavy double doors, the soft click of my heels echoing sharply against the polished marble floor, and took a seat in the very last row of the gallery, completely alone, surrounded by a sea of empty wooden benches. When the side door of the holding area hissed open, the sheer, devastating physical reality of my family's new existence finally materialized before my eyes. Evelyn, Terrence, and Kiara were shuffled into the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, their wrists heavily shackled to thick steel chains wrapped around their waists, stripping them entirely of the designer armor they had used to intimidate the world. Evelyn, a woman who would previously refuse to check her own mail without applying a full face of expensive foundation and perfectly coiffed hair, looked incredibly small and fragile in her oversized, faded orange jumpsuit, her face sallow, deeply lined with terror, her eyes darting frantically around the massive room like a trapped animal. Terrence's shoulders were entirely slumped, his arrogant posture completely broken. Shivering slightly under the aggressive air conditioning of the federal facility, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, entirely unable to look up and face the public humiliation he had always been terrified of. But it was the sight of Kiara that truly anchored the absolute finality of my decision. My 26-year-old daughter, who just last night had viciously threatened to cut me out of her life over a luxury condo deposit, was now sobbing uncontrollably, her chest heaving, the heavy chains rattling against her wrists as she desperately scanned the empty gallery, looking for the mother she had always treated as a disposable shield. When her tear-filled, panicked eyes finally locked onto me, sitting quietly in the back row, clad in my glowing ivory suit, a sudden desperate spark of hope flashed across her face, genuinely believing that the strong black woman conditioning would finally kick in, that I would suddenly leap up, mortgage my own soul, and offer the judge whatever he demanded to buy her freedom. "Mom," Kiara mouthed silently across the silent expanse of the courtroom, aggressively straining against the heavy steel chains, her face twisted in a pathetic, agonizing plea. "Help me, please, I'm sorry." I did not break eye contact, nor did I offer a comforting nod. I simply tilted my head a fraction of an inch, my expression remaining completely smooth, impassive, and brutally cold, silently communicating the absolute, irreversible truth. The mother she had conspired to destroy no longer existed, and the woman sitting in the gallery was merely a spectator watching the consequences of her actions unfold. Judge Mitchell, a stern, unforgiving federal magistrate with a reputation for mercilessly prosecuting white-collar criminals, slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot, demanding absolute silence in his courtroom before peering over his reading glasses at the three defendants trembling before his bench. Given the overwhelming, meticulously documented evidence provided to the United States Attorney's Office, which includes recorded confessions of intent to tamper with life-saving cardiac medication, large-scale wire fraud, and the coordinated attempt to flee the jurisdiction by electronically transferring stolen assets to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands mere hours before arrest, Judge Mitchell boomed, his voice vibrating with absolute disdain, his eyes locking directly onto Terrence. This court formally designates all three defendants as extreme flight risks and a profound danger to the community. Bail is unequivocally denied, and the defendants will be remanded to federal custody until the commencement of their trial. Evelyn's knees buckled entirely, a guttural, horrific wail tearing from her throat as two federal marshals rushed forward to catch her, roughly hauling the once proud matriarch back up by her chained arms, while Terrence simply closed his eyes, a silent, pathetic tear rolling down his cheek as the crushing reality of a 25-year sentence finally settled over him. Kiara collapsed into a hysterical, hyperventilating panic, screaming for me as the marshals forcefully turned them around and began dragging them back toward the heavy steel door of the holding cell. The heavy chains rattling against the floor, a chaotic, agonizing symphony of self-inflicted destruction that I watched with the detached, analytical precision of a forensic auditor closing a fraudulent account. I stood up from the wooden bench before the heavy door even closed behind them, smoothing the front of my silk blazer, and walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the bright, late-afternoon sunlight of the plaza, taking a deep, restorative breath of the warm Georgia air, entirely unburdened, completely untethered, and fundamentally free. But as I drove back to the quiet, pristine sanctuary of my Vinings townhouse, ready to pour myself a glass of expensive red wine and finally, truly rest, I noticed a thick, brown, certified envelope resting on my marble entryway table, slipped under the door by a specialized federal courier. I sliced the heavy paper open with a silver letter opener, sliding out a handwritten note bearing the official seal of the United States Attorney's Office, written in Trey Stevenson's distinctive, sharp handwriting, reading simply, "Rosalind, we pulled the full property records for the Cascade Heights estate during the seizure. Evelyn lied about how she originally acquired that house, and you need to look closely at the attached deed transfer from 30 years ago, because the person who actually bought it wasn't your father, and the name hidden on the original, untampered title means they didn't just steal from you. They have been living inside a house that legally belonged to you since the day you turned 18. The heavy, certified envelope from the United States Attorney's Office felt less like a standard legal disclosure and far more like the final, devastating cornerstone of a 30-year psychological labyrinth, its thick manila edges resting quietly against the polished marble of my entryway table as I stared at the 30-year-old property deed Trey Stevenson had slipped inside. I slowly unfolded the fragile, yellowing parchment under the soft glow of my foyer chandelier, my eyes instantly locking onto the faded, notarized signature at the very bottom of the page, a signature that belonged to an 18-year-old version of myself, written in the slightly uneven, hopeful cursive of a young woman who had just graduated high school and trusted her parents implicitly. The horrific, suffocating reality of what I was looking at washed over me not in a sudden, violent wave, but with the slow, freezing creep of a rising tide. Exactly 30 years ago, on the morning of my 18th birthday, my mother, Evelyn, had placed a stack of complex legal documents on the kitchen counter, casually explaining with her trademark, dismissive, aristocratic sigh that my father needed me to co-sign a routine guarantor form for my upcoming college tuition loans. I had signed the papers without a single moment of hesitation, conditioned from childhood to be the obedient, silent foundation of the family, entirely unaware that I was not signing student loan documents, but rather the master property deed to the sprawling 6-bedroom Cascade Heights estate, officially taking on the sole legal ownership and the massive financial liability of a mansion I would never be permitted to live in. For 3 decades, Evelyn and Terrence had masterfully orchestrated the most insidious, cold-blooded psychological cage imaginable, loudly demanding that I prove my love and loyalty by paying the $4,000 monthly mortgage to save my parents' home from foreclosure, when in reality, they were legally squatting in a house that belonged entirely to me, forcing me to finance their opulent bourgeois lifestyle, using my own credit, my own youth, and my own exhaustion as the building materials for their grand illusion. They had not just stolen my money, they had systematically stolen the peace of my 20s and 30s, manipulating my deeply ingrained cultural obligation to honor my mother and father, weaponizing my grace to ensure I remained permanently tethered to their parasitic existence. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their deception should have brought me to my knees. It should have triggered a chaotic, hysterical breakdown right there on the imported hardwood floor of my Vinings townhouse. But as I ran my manicured fingertip over the embossed state seal on the deed, I felt absolutely no urge to scream or shatter the crystal vase resting beside me. Instead, a profound, chilling, and exquisitely beautiful sense of absolute sovereignty settled deeply into my bones, a terrifying calm that entirely eradicated the last lingering, microscopic traces of the strong black woman trauma bond that had chained me to their sinking ship. I carefully placed the deed back into the envelope, poured myself a single glass of an exceptionally rare, full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon, and walked out onto my private terrace, looking out over the glittering, sprawling canopy of the Atlanta skyline, breathing in the cool night air with the lungs of a woman who had finally, legally, and spiritually conquered her captors. The following morning, the sun rose over the city with a sharp, brilliant clarity, and I dressed myself with the methodical, precise intention of an executioner preparing for a final swing, choosing a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray designer suit that mirrored the cold, impenetrable steel of my new boundaries, pairing it with dark leather gloves and a pair of understated diamond stud earrings. I drove my Mercedes out of the quiet sanctuary of my neighborhood and navigated back toward the historic tree-lined enclave of Cascade Heights, pulling up to the property that I now knew had belonged to me for my entire adult life, observing the heavy, bright yellow FBI crime scene tape stretched across the splintered remnants of the custom oak double doors. Because Trey Stevenson had formally filed the 30-year-old deed with the federal court first thing in the morning, immediately proving that the property was legally owned by an innocent third party rather than the indicted defendants, the Department of Justice had officially lifted the asset forfeiture hold on the physical structure, granting me absolute uncontested access to my own home. I ducked gracefully under the yellow tape, the soft rhythmic click of my heels against the brick walkway echoing in the suffocating silence of the neighborhood, and pushed open the ruined doors, stepping into the massive, echoing foyer of the mansion that had served as the headquarters of my family's emotional terrorism. The interior of the house was a chaotic, devastating portrait of a fallen empire. The federal agents had systematically dismantled the illusion of Evelyn's aristocratic wealth, pulling the imported Persian rugs up to search the floorboards, overturning the velvet settees, and emptying the antique mahogany display cabinets, leaving the expensive, fragile porcelain figurines scattered across the floor like the shattered remnants of my mother's fake legacy. The air was stale, heavy with the lingering, sickeningly sweet scent of Evelyn's Tom Ford perfume, mixed with the metallic tang of fear and the dust of the federal raid. But for the first time in 35 years, standing in this space did not cause my chest to tighten with anxiety. I walked slowly through the sprawling rooms, running my gloved hand over the expensive wainscoting I had paid to install, the custom drapery I had financed, and the grand dining table where I had been forced to sit quietly in the corner during holidays while Terrence bragged about his fraudulent businesses and Kiara rolled her eyes at my mere existence. I made my way up the sweeping, curved staircase to the master suite, pushing open the heavy doors to Evelyn's private domain, a massive room overflowing with thousands of dollars of St. John knits, designer handbags, and custom jewelry boxes, all purchased with the stolen equity of my father's life insurance and the lifeblood of my own labor. I did not tear her clothes off the hangers, I did not smash her expensive vanity mirror, and I did not engage in any petty, physical destruction of her cherished belongings. My revenge was not going to be a loud, chaotic tantrum. It was going to be a cold, permanent erasure. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket and dialed the direct number for Atlanta's most ruthless, high-end estate liquidation firm, a company specializing in rapidly emptying foreclosed luxury properties and selling the contents at absolute wholesale prices to aggressive bargain hunters. "This is Rosalind Vance," I said smoothly when the senior liquidator answered the line, my voice echoing slightly in the vast empty cavern of my mother's bedroom. "I hold the sole legal title to the 6-bedroom estate on Cascade Road, and I need an immediate, total clearance liquidation of every single item inside the property walls. I want the designer clothing bagged and sold by the pound, the antique furniture hauled to your warehouse by sundown, and the crystal donated to a local women's domestic abuse shelter, leaving absolutely nothing but the bare drywall and the original fixtures." The liquidator, recognizing the tone of a woman who was entirely uninterested in haggling over sentimental value, promised to have a fleet of massive moving trucks and a 20-person crew on the property within the hour. And as I ended the call, I felt a deep, visceral satisfaction in knowing that Evelyn's entire identity, her meticulously curated, desperately maintained illusion of superiority, was about to be sold for pennies on the dollar to strangers who would never even know her name. I walked down the hall to the guest bedroom that had been permanently occupied by Terrence whenever one of his phantom companies inevitably collapsed, finding his closet packed with the bespoke silk suits and imported Italian leather shoes he had bought using the offshore accounts tied to my forged signature, leaving the door wide open for the liquidators to strip it entirely bare. But the final, most profound moment of clarity occurred when I stepped into Kiara's luxury suite at the end of the hallway, a room I had completely funded and decorated to her exact, spoiled specifications, discovering that amidst the chaos of the FBI raid, she had desperately tried to pack a single Louis Vuitton duffel bag with her most valuable diamond jewelry, completely abandoning the framed family photos, the handmade quilt I had sewn for her when she was a child, and any actual sentimental artifacts. Her priorities had always been entirely transactional, completely devoid of any authentic love or loyalty, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my decision to let her face a federal judge without the protection of my checkbook was not an act of cruelty, but a necessary, long overdue alignment with reality. I spent the next 4 hours sitting quietly on the back terrace overlooking the meticulously landscaped gardens, drinking a cup of coffee I had brought from home in a thermos, watching with an absolute majestic serenity as the liquidation crew swarmed the property, hauling away decades of toxic history in heavy industrial boxes, stripping the mansion of its heavy, oppressive soul until it was nothing more than an empty, hollow shell of brick and wood. Just as the final truck was pulling out of the driveway, carrying the very last of Evelyn's velvet furniture away to be auctioned off, my phone vibrated in my pocket, the screen displaying a restricted automated caller ID indicating an incoming collect call from the United States Federal Detention Center in downtown Atlanta. I stared at the screen for a long, quiet moment, feeling the rhythmic, steady beating of my own heart, completely devoid of the panic that used to consume me whenever my mother called, before slowly sliding my finger across the glass to accept the charges, fully prepared to deliver the final crushing blow to the matriarch who had tried to bury me alive. This is a federally recorded call from an inmate at the Atlanta Metropolitan Detention Center, the sterile, automated voice announced, immediately followed by the frantic, echoing, and deeply pathetic sound of Evelyn's voice. "Rosalind, are you there?" Evelyn gasped, her tone completely stripped of its usual haughty, Southern aristocratic polish, replaced entirely by the raspy, hyperventilating desperation of a woman who had just spent her first 72 hours sleeping on a thin plastic mattress surrounded by concrete and steel. "You have to get me out of here, Rosalind. The food is inedible. The guards are completely disrespectful, and they have me housed in a block with violent criminals. You are my daughter. You are a licensed auditor. You know people in the federal government. You have to call your wealth manager and post the bond. I cannot survive in this place." I did not interrupt her frantic, delusional rambling, allowing the silence on my end of the line to stretch out, heavy and thick with the absolute power imbalance that had finally permanently shifted in my favor, forcing her to listen to the hollow echo of her own breathless panic. "The federal judge specifically denied your bail, Evelyn, designating you an extreme flight risk and a danger to the community due to the irrefutable, documented evidence that you actively conspired to murder your own husband for financial gain," I stated calmly, my voice perfectly modulated, echoing slightly against the bare walls of the empty, liquidated mansion. "There is no bond to post. There are no favors to call in. And Arthur Sterling no longer manages a single cent of the money you stole. Your accounts have been entirely seized, and the federal defenders assigned to your case have already informed the prosecutor that you have absolutely no assets left to mount a private defense." "I am your mother!" Evelyn suddenly shrieked, the desperation curdling back into the toxic, entitled rage she had used to control me for decades, her voice cracking violently through the phone speaker. "You ungrateful, spiteful bitch! I gave you life. I covered for you. I kept this family together, and if you leave me in this cage, I swear to God I will tell the federal prosecutors everything about the Cascade Heights house. I will tell them you knew about the forged deed. I will drag your pristine reputation through the mud, and I will make sure the IRS strips your auditing license and throws you in the cell right next to me." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her threat, attempting to weaponize the very property deed she had used to secretly enslave me 30 years ago, genuinely believing she still held a knife to my throat even from behind federal bars, was the ultimate confirmation that she possessed absolutely no soul, no remorse, and no maternal instinct whatsoever. I let out a soft, quiet sigh, the kind of gentle exhale a tired mother gives a deeply stubborn, foolish child, before leaning slightly closer to the microphone of my phone, ensuring my final words to her would be recorded, archived, and permanently burned into her memory for the entirety of her 25-year federal sentence. "You cannot threaten me with a house that I already legally own, Evelyn," I whispered. The cold, lethal certainty in my voice instantly silencing her hysterical screaming, leaving nothing but the sound of her jagged breathing on the line. "Trey Stevenson handed me the original deed yesterday. I know you tricked me into signing it when I was 18. I know you made me pay the mortgage on my own property for 30 years. And I know you tried to steal the equity using my daughter's forged signature. But what you do not know, as you sit in that federal cage wearing a faded orange jumpsuit, is that because the property is legally mine, the Department of Justice lifted the asset forfeiture hold this morning, and I am currently standing in the master bedroom of my house, watching a liquidation crew haul the last of your precious designer clothes to a discount wholesale warehouse." The profound, suffocating silence that erupted on Evelyn's end of the line was a masterpiece of human devastation. I could practically hear the final, desperate gears in her mind violently shattering as the absolute totality of her defeat crushed the remaining air from her lungs, realizing that the unbreakable foundation she had abused her entire life had not just walked away, but had seamlessly transformed into the architect of her permanent destruction. "You have nothing left to threaten me with. You have no money to bribe me with, and you have no family left to manipulate," I continued smoothly, wrapping my dark leather coat tighter against the chill of the empty room. "Enjoy your federal meals, Evelyn, because this is the very last time you will ever hear my voice. I am hanging up now, and I am putting this house on the luxury real estate market tomorrow morning, using the millions of dollars from the sale to expand my own empire, built entirely on the ashes of yours." I pressed the red button to end the call, instantly cutting off the sound of her frantic final gasp, plunging the empty, immaculate space of the Cascade Heights estate into a beautiful, absolute silence. And as I walked out the front door, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me for the very last time, I didn't look back at the ruins, my eyes focused entirely on the brilliant, unclouded horizon of my own sovereign future. The sale of the sprawling 6-bedroom Cascade Heights estate closed exactly 14 days after the federal liquidation crew stripped it down to its bare, echoing drywall. The transaction executed with a swift, merciless efficiency that completely erased the toxic legacy my mother had spent 3 decades meticulously constructing. I sat in the pristine, glass-walled conference room of a prestigious Buckhead title agency, the afternoon sun casting long, sharp, geometric shadows across the polished mahogany table, completely alone save for the senior closing attorney who silently slid the final stack of heavy, watermarked documents toward my manicured hands. As I picked up the silver Mont Blanc pen to sign the transfer of title, my mind inevitably drifted back to that chaotic, suffocating morning 30 years ago in Evelyn's kitchen, remembering the naive, eager 18-year-old girl who had blindly scribbled her name onto a stack of forged papers simply because she desperately craved her mother's elusive approval, entirely unaware that she was signing away the peace and financial autonomy of her 20s and 30s. There was a profound, almost dizzying, poetic justice in the physical act of my signature now. The very same cursive script that had once silently enslaved me to a lifetime of paying a $4,000 monthly mortgage for a family of parasites was now the exact instrument setting me permanently, legally free. The cash buyer, an out-of-state corporate developer who cared absolutely nothing for the bourgeois social history of the neighborhood, had purchased the property for $3.2 million, entirely unbothered by the bright yellow federal raid tape that still clung to the splintered remnants of the custom oak double doors. When I pressed the tip of the pen to the final signature line, I did not feel a sudden cinematic rush of adrenaline or the bitter sting of nostalgic grief. I felt the cold, breathtakingly beautiful serenity of a surgeon making the final suture after successfully amputating a gangrenous, rotting limb. The attorney stamped the documents, offered a polite professional nod, and within 45 minutes the massive sum of liquid capital was securely wired into my private, impenetrable offshore trust, permanently closing the longest, most exhausting chapter of my psychological existence. The absolute deafening silence that enveloped my life in the weeks and months following the federal raid was an entirely new, almost intoxicating sensory experience. For my entire adult life, my nervous system had been permanently wired to a state of chronic, agonizing hypervigilance, my body constantly bracing for the inevitable, disastrous ring of my phone, demanding that I fix Terrence's latest bankruptcy, cover Kiara's exorbitant credit card bills, or absorb Evelyn's toxic, passive-aggressive tantrums. But now, my encrypted smartphone rested quietly on my marble kitchen island, entirely silent, completely purged of the contacts that had once treated me as a disposable, automated utility. The social fallout within the elite, hypocritical circles of Atlanta's black bourgeoisie was swift, brutal, and utterly predictable. The same sorority sisters and deaconesses at Greater Shiloh Baptist Church who used to sip expensive tea in Evelyn's formal living room and subtly looked down on my quiet single-mother lifestyle instantly turned into ravenous vultures, viciously tearing Evelyn's reputation to shreds the second the Department of Justice unsealed the RICO and conspiracy indictments. Pastor Sterling, true to his word and his unshakable moral compass, officially struck Evelyn's name from the senior deaconess registry, completely purging the church's financial records of her fraudulent logistics charity, and sending me a quiet, handwritten note of profound respect, acknowledging the unimaginable spiritual strength it took to stand in the truth while my own bloodline attempted to bury me in lies. 9 months later, the federal justice system finally, methodically ground the remnants of my family into fine dust. I did not attend the sentencing hearings at the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of my presence or the opportunity to perform their desperate, hysterical apologies for an audience of one. Instead, I received the final unredacted disposition report directly from Assistant United States Attorney Trey Stevenson over a quiet, elegant dinner at a dimly lit, upscale steakhouse in Midtown. Trey sat across from me in the plush leather booth, sipping a glass of aged bourbon, his sharp, intelligent eyes tracing the relaxed, glowing contours of my face, clearly noticing that the heavy, suffocating exhaustion that had plagued me for years had entirely vanished, replaced by the radiant, untouchable aura of a woman who slept 8 uninterrupted hours a night. He slid the heavy manila envelope across the white linen tablecloth, his voice dropping to a low, respectful register as he outlined the exact arithmetic of their destruction. Terrence, having utterly failed to negotiate a plea deal because I'd already frozen and surrendered the offshore accounts he intended to use as leverage, was handed a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years in a high-security federal penitentiary, his arrogant entrepreneurial illusions permanently shattered against the cold concrete of a cell he would not leave until he was well into his 60s. Evelyn, despite her frantic, pathetic attempts to manipulate the federal psychiatrists into declaring her mentally unfit, was sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of early parole, the judge specifically noting the breathtaking depravity of a wife slowly poisoning her dying husband to expedite a life insurance payout. And Kiara, my only child, the 26-year-old daughter who had casually traded her grandfather's life and her mother's freedom for the deposit on a luxury condo, was sentenced to 12 years in a federal women's correctional facility in Aliceville, Alabama. Trey watched me closely as he delivered Kiara's sentence, searching my eyes for the inevitable, biological crack of maternal grief. But what he found was merely a deep, quiet pool of absolute acceptance. The cultural conditioning of the strong black woman dictates that a mother must throw herself onto the pyre to save her child, no matter how monstrous that child has become. But I had fundamentally rejected that toxic theology. Kiara was an adult who made a calculated, sociopathic choice, and I refused to disrespect my father's memory by shedding tears for the woman who had helped stop his heart. I simply reached across the table, picked up my glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, and took a slow, appreciative sip, thanking Trey for his uncompromising integrity, leaving the heavy manila envelope entirely unopened on the tablecloth when we finally walked out of the restaurant and into the warm Georgia night. The true, monumental pivot of my existence occurred exactly 3 weeks later, sitting in the penthouse suite of Onyx Financial Forensics, alongside my wealth manager, Arthur Sterling, watching the secure federal banking portal on his encrypted laptop. The Department of the Treasury, bound by the strict legal statutes of the IRS whistleblower program, had officially finalized the processing of my claim, verifying that my surrendered ledgers had directly resulted in the recovery of over $40 million in stolen federal taxes, unpaid penalties, and laundered commercial equity across Evelyn and Terrence's sprawling network of shell companies. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, the screen refreshed, and a completely clean, legally unassailable, and heavily guarded federal wire transfer of $12.4 million deposited directly into my private sovereign accounts. It was a staggering, life-altering sum of capital, but sitting in that glass-walled office, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, the money felt less like a lottery winning and more like a hard-fought, bloody invoice finally being paid in full. It was the exact calculated monetary value of my stolen youth, my unpaid labor, and my unappreciated grace. I immediately directed Arthur to establish the Deacon Marcus Vance Educational Trust, dedicating $3 million to a heavily endowed, completely blind scholarship fund designed specifically for underprivileged, brilliant young minority women who were at risk of abandoning their college educations to care for toxic, financially abusive family members, ensuring that the legacy of the only man who truly loved me would be used to break the very chains my mother had used to bind me. I injected another $2 million into the expansion of my independent auditing firm, leasing an additional floor in the high-rise tower and hiring a team of incredibly sharp, meticulous women who looked just like me. Women who had been overlooked and underestimated in corporate boardrooms their entire lives, giving them the platform and the capital to build their own empires. As for the rest of the fortune, it was locked away in an impenetrable fortress of municipal bonds and high-yield corporate indices, ensuring that my bloodline's chaotic poverty would never, ever touch me again. A year after the crack of my mother's palm echoed through the sanctuary of Greater Shiloh Baptist Church, I stood on the sprawling private terrace of my new home, a stunning, mid-century modern architectural masterpiece I had purchased in cash, hidden deep within a heavily wooded gated enclave in Sandy Springs, completely invisible from the main road and entirely inaccessible to anyone who did not possess the specific, rotating security code. The morning air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of Georgia pines and blooming jasmine, the absolute silence broken only by the gentle, rhythmic splashing of the infinity pool cascading over the stone retaining wall. I was dressed in a sweeping, floor-length silk robe the color of deep sapphire, my hair flowing freely down my back, my skin glowing with the profound, undeniable beauty of a woman who is no longer carrying the crushing weight of a family that secretly hated her. I walked into my pristine, sun-drenched kitchen, a space filled with imported Italian marble and high-end culinary tools that I used simply because I loved to cook, not because it was demanded of me, and I pressed a shot of rich, dark espresso, the rich aroma filling the massive, quiet house. There was no one here to demand my money, no one here to critique my tone, and no one here to casually siphon my life force to fuel their own illusions. For decades, they had treated me as the unbreakable foundation, the quiet, exhausted concrete block buried deep in the dark earth, specifically designed to bear the crushing weight of their massive, fraudulent architecture while they danced in the sunlight and claimed the credit for standing tall. They had genuinely, arrogantly believed that because I was silent, because I absorbed their disrespect with pressed suits and flawless grace, I was entirely incapable of movement, entirely oblivious to my own immense power. But what Evelyn, Terrence, and Kiara entirely failed to understand was the fundamental law of spiritual and psychological physics. A foundation does not actually need a house in order to exist, but a sprawling, opulent house absolutely cannot survive for a single second without its foundation. I did not scream, I did not beg for their love, and I did not stage a chaotic, dramatic confrontation to prove that I was bleeding. I simply realized my own supreme, incalculable worth, and I quietly, elegantly, and legally stepped out from underneath them, allowing the entire hollow, parasitic structure of their lives to violently collapse under the sheer gravity of its own monstrous greed. I walked back out onto the terrace, holding my warm ceramic mug, looking up through the sprawling branches of the ancient oak trees at the brilliant, unclouded blue expanse of the morning sky, taking a deep, slow breath of air that belonged entirely, exclusively to me. I was no longer the tragic, exhausted anchor of a broken bloodline. I was the sovereign architect of my own magnificent, untouchable empire, and in the profound, beautiful silence of their total oblivion, I had finally learned exactly what it felt like to reign. To everyone who has sat with me through this long, heavy journey, to every person who has listened to my story from the sharp crack of my mother's palm in that suffocating church to the profound, beautiful silence of my new terrace, thank you. I know exactly why so many of you stayed until the very end. You stayed because my story is not just mine, it is yours. You know exactly what it feels like to be the unseen concrete foundation in the dark. You know the bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of being the designated crisis manager, the financial safety net, and the emotional punching bag for a family that only claims to love you when your checkbook is open and your boundaries are erased. I am speaking directly to the woman listening to my voice right now. The woman who is quietly crying in her car before she walks into her house. The woman standing at her kitchen sink feeling completely invisible. The woman who has sacrificed her youth, her peace, and her credit score to keep a toxic bloodline afloat. I know you are tired. I know you are terrified of being called bitter, cold, or selfish the moment you finally decide to say no. Please hear me clearly. Your boundless grace is a beautiful, sacred thing, but it was never meant to be a suicide pact. You are allowed to stop setting yourself on fire, simply to keep other people warm, especially people who will only ever complain about the temperature of the flames. You are allowed to put the heavy, parasitic burden down. You are allowed to walk away from the chaotic, exhausting performance of family loyalty and build a quiet, impenetrable empire of your own. Thank you for holding space for my truth and for allowing my healing to intersect with yours. If my journey resonated with your spirit, or if you are currently standing in the dark, preparing to draw your own quiet, devastating boundaries, please let me know in the comments below. Tell me where you are listening from, and share your own stories of reclaiming your peace. We draw immense, unbreakable strength from witnessing each other's survival. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with a sister, a mother, or a friend who desperately needs to be reminded of her own supreme worth today. Remember, a foundation does not need a house to exist. Protect your peace, guard your finances, and never, ever apologize for